You're driving a tank across the desert at night. There are no roads, no landmarks, just endless sand in every direction. It's pitch black. Your mission is to hit a target 200 miles away, and you need to arrive at the exact same time as 50 other tanks or the whole plan falls apart. How do you navigate? In World War II, you'd be lost. In Vietnam, you'd be lost. But in Desert Storm, you pull out a small handheld device that tells you exactly where you are, down to the meter. It's called GPS, and almost nobody had heard of it before 1991. This technology won the war before the first shot was fired. Welcome back to Gulf War Chronicles. Today we're talking about the weapon system that doesn't get mentioned when people discuss Desert Storm. Not the M1 Abrams, not the F-117, not the Patriot missiles. I'm talking about the Global Positioning System. GPS. This technology was so new that the military didn't have enough units for everyone who needed them. Soldiers bought commercial GPS receivers at Radio Shack and Walmart with their own money. And those 24 satellites orbiting Earth became the secret weapon that made the entire coalition ground offensive possible. Let me explain why. Before Desert Storm, navigation in the desert was a nightmare. The Kuwaiti and Iraqi desert is almost completely featureless. Sand dunes that all look the same. No trees, no buildings, no rivers. During the day, you could navigate by the sun and compass, but you'd still get lost easily. At night, forget it. Traditional military navigation relied on maps, compasses, and dead reckoning, estimating where you are based on how far you've traveled in what direction. In the desert, this doesn't work. You drift off course by miles without realizing it. Coalition planners knew this was going to be a massive problem. The entire strategy for the ground war, the famous left hook, depended on moving hundreds of thousands of troops through empty desert, hitting objectives at specific times, and doing it all while maintaining formation. If units got lost or showed up at the wrong time, the whole plan would fall apart. They needed a solution. GPS was that solution, but there was one huge problem. The military didn't have enough of them. The GPS system had been developed by the Department of Defense starting in the 1970s. By 1991, all 24 satellites were in orbit, and the system was technically operational. But military-grade GPS receivers were expensive and scarce. The military had only ordered enough for a fraction of the forces deploying to Desert Storm. When units arrived in Saudi Arabia and realized they'd be navigating across featureless desert, they panicked. How were they supposed to find their way? That's when something remarkable happened. Soldiers started buying their own GPS units. Commercial GPS receivers had just become available to the public in the late 80s and early 1990s. They were primitive by today's standards. No color screens, no maps, just latitude and longitude coordinates. But they worked. Companies like Magellan and Garmin were making handheld units that civilians could buy for hiking and boating. Soldiers' families back home went to Radio Shack, Walmart, sporting goods stores, bought these commercial GPS units and shipped them to the Gulf. The Department of Defense actually encouraged this. They even turned off something called Selective Availability for the duration of the war. See, the military had intentionally degraded the civilian GPS signal to make it less accurate. They didn't want enemies using GPS against them. Civilian receivers could only get you within 100 meters of your actual position. But during Desert Storm, DoD turned off that degradation. Suddenly, civilian GPS units were just as accurate as military ones, within 10 to 15 meters. Every soldier with a Radio Shack GPS receiver now had precision navigation. Staff Sergeant Mike Harris, different Mike Harris than the PSYOPs guy from another video, was a tank commander in the 3rd Armored Division. He bought a Magellan GPS unit that his wife sent from the States. He described how it changed everything. Before GPS, we'd be constantly checking maps trying to figure out where we were. With GPS, I knew exactly where I was at all times. I could navigate to any coordinate in the desert, day or night, sandstorm or clear sky. It was like cheating. The impact on the ground war was incredible. The left hook maneuver, where coalition forces swept wide around Iraqi defenses through the empty desert, wouldn't have been possible without GPS units traveled hundreds of miles through terrain with no features, maintaining formation, arriving at their objectives on time. The Iraqis expected coalition forces to attack straight into their prepared defenses. Instead, coalition forces went around, through areas the Iraqis thought were impassable because of navigation difficulties. GPS made the impassable passable. Artillery units used GPS to position their guns with incredible precision. Traditional artillery relied on careful surveying to know exactly where you were before you could calculate firing solutions. With GPS, a battery could roll into position in the middle of the desert, get their coordinates instantly, and start firing accurate missions within minutes. The speed and accuracy of coalition artillery fire shocked Iraqi forces, who were used to Soviet-style artillery that took hours to set up and calibrate. Helicopter pilots loved GPS. Flying across the desert at night in a helicopter was extremely dangerous without good navigation. There were no visual references. Pilots had to rely on their instruments and hope they didn't drift off course. With GPS, helicopter crews could fly nap of the earth, very low to avoid radar, across hundreds of miles of desert and arrive exactly where they needed to be. Task Force Normandy, the Apache mission that started the war, used GPS to navigate to those Iraqi radar sites in total darkness. Even supply convoys used GPS. Keeping hundreds of thousands of troops supplied in the middle of the desert required constant truck convoys moving fuel, ammunition, food, water, and equipment. Before GPS, convoy navigation was a constant struggle. Trucks would get separated, lost, wander off course. With GPS, convoys could navigate point to point across the desert as easily as driving on a highway. The logistics miracle that kept coalition forces supplied during the ground war was enabled by GPS. The Iraqis didn't have GPS. They were using maps, compasses, and traditional navigation. When Iraqi units tried to maneuver in the desert, they frequently got lost. There are reports of entire Iraqi units wandering lost in the desert, ending up miles from where they were supposed to be. When they retreated, they struggled to find roads and routes back to Iraq. The navigation advantage GPS gave coalition forces was almost invisible, but it was absolutely decisive. Here's a specific example of how important this was. During the Battle of 73 Easting, which we covered in another video, Captain H.R. McMaster's Eagle Troop was racing across the desert pursuing Iraqi forces. They were moving at speed through a sandstorm that reduced visibility to almost zero. McMaster's tanks maintained formation and hit their objectives exactly where they were supposed to be because they had GPS. The Iraqis they were fighting had no idea where they were in relation to friendly forces. Some Iraqi units fired on their own troops because they were disoriented in the sandstorm. GPS gave coalition forces situational awareness that the Iraqis completely lacked. After Desert Storm, GPS became standard equipment throughout the U.S. military. The commercial GPS industry exploded. Companies realized there was a massive civilian market for navigation technology. Within a few years, GPS receivers were in cars, boats, planes, and eventually smartphones. The technology that most people first heard about during Desert Storm became ubiquitous. Today, we take GPS for granted. Your phone has it. Your car has it. You use it every day without thinking about it. But in '91, it was revolutionary. The fact that soldiers had to buy their own GPS units became a minor scandal after the war. Congress held hearings asking why the military hadn't equipped troops properly. The Pentagon responded by fast-tracking procurement of military GPS receivers. By the time of the Iraq War in 2003, every vehicle, every aircraft, every soldier had access to military-grade GPS, but Desert Storm was the proof of concept, fought partially with radio, shack equipment, and soldiers' own money. There's a broader lesson here about technology and warfare. Desert Storm was the first war where space-based systems, satellites, played a critical role in ground combat. GPS satellites guided troops. Intelligence satellites provided reconnaissance. Communication satellites linked the battlefield to command centers. This was the beginning of what military analysts call the revolution in military affairs. Wars would now be fought with information dominance enabled by satellites, computers, and networks. GPS was the most visible example of that revolution. The Iraqis learned a harsh lesson about technology gaps. They'd built their military based on Soviet doctrine from the 1970s. Mass artillery, dug-in defensive positions, centralized command and control. That doctrine assumed both sides would be equally blind in the desert, equally dependent on traditional navigation and communication. GPS shattered that assumption. Coalition forces could maneuver with precision while Iraqi forces stumbled around. It wasn't even a fair fight from a technological standpoint. If you served in Desert Storm and used GPS, whether a military receiver or a Radio Shack unit, leave a comment below about how it affected your experience. The GPS story is one of those behind-the-scenes aspects of Desert Storm that doesn't get much attention, but it fundamentally shaped how the war was fought and won. Thanks for watching Gulf War Chronicles. The next time you use Google Maps or your car's navigation system, remember that the technology you're using was proven in combat in the Iraqi desert in 1991. 24 satellites orbiting Earth, originally built for the military, now guide billions of people every single day. Desert Storm was the moment GPS went from experimental military technology to essential tool of modern life. That's a legacy that extends far beyond the 100-hour ground war. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. We're telling the stories of Desert Storm that go beyond tanks and planes, the technology, the logistics, the human decisions that made everything else possible. I'll see you in the next one.